Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History. So in Unit 4 of AP World History, we've been talking about the expansion of sea-based empires. And in this video, we're going to talk about the momentous change that occurred when the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere came crashing together. And that change has a name. It is the Columbian Exchange. And if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's get to it. First off, if you're new here, my name is Steve Heimler. I'm here to help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And if that's something you're into, then subscribe and come along with me. And I know I'm not the only one who's making AP World History videos out there, but I'm doing it the most balded, the most bearded, and the most gap-toothed. Alright, enough of that, let's talk about the Columbian Exchange. And I don't think I'm overstating it to say that the Columbian Exchange changed the world on a scale that few other events had. In the short run, the Columbian Exchange meant disaster for the natives of the Americas, but on the other hand, it meant extraordinary wealth and profitability for the Europeans. But in the long run, for all involved, the Columbian Exchange introduced new ways of life and new ways of death through the mutual sharing of the East and the West. So first of all, what is the Columbian Exchange? Well, its name comes from our good buddy Christopher Columbus, whose landing on the island of Hispaniola launched this whole exchange. But if you want a definition, it's essentially this. The Columbian Exchange is the transfer of people, animals, plants, and diseases from the east to the west and from the west to the east. So let's start with an upper. Diseases. Until Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, Afro-Eurasia and the American continents were completely isolated. And through a series of unfortunate or fortunate events, depending on how you look at it, these two worlds came crashing together. Because of this long-term separation of these two people groups, the Native Americans had no immunities to some of the more devastating European diseases. And the most devastating of the bunch was smallpox. Smallpox was an airborne disease that Europeans had been exposed to for many centuries, and even though it was still devastating, they had built up some immunity to it. But when the white people showed up in the Americas and started coughing all over the natives, the smallpox contagion was deadly to a people who had never encountered it before. It was this disease that was responsible for the large-scale death that occurred in the Americas. In general, historians estimate that it wiped out about 50% of the native population, and in some places, upwards of 80 to 90% of the native populations were destroyed. But that's not all. The more Europeans arrived in the New World, the more diseases they brought with them. They brought malaria and measles and the flu, and all of these wrought disaster on the native peoples. And in terms of its scope, you could compare it to the devastating effects of the Black Death in the former period. Alright, if you're sufficiently depressed after that, let's move on to some happier matters, namely animals and food. The sharing of animals and food in the Columbian Exchange actually went both ways, from east to west and from west to east. And in many cases, these food and animals, when they were introduced into these societies, had massive effects. For example, the Europeans introduced pigs and cows and wheat and grapes into the Americas. And these food items eventually became staples of the American diet. I mean, what would we be today without beef? I mean, I know that 50% of your population is dead from smallpox, but on the upside, cheeseburgers. The Europeans also introduced horses to the Western Hemisphere, and the adoption of that animal changed the lives of the Native Americans who lived in the plains regions. After they learned to ride horses, they were able to hunt buffalo with greater efficiency, and that meant, in many cases, excess food. Also, the horse gave tribes a competitive advantage against other tribes who did not have horses, so not only could they kill buffalo better, they could kill other human beings better too. But there's also some food that traveled from the west to the east. The Mesoamericans introduced some very important food items to the Europeans. For example, you had cacao, also maize, which is a kind of corn, and potatoes, which is a kind of potato. And when these were introduced to Europeans, it led to an expanded diet and, more importantly, massive population growth. Alright, now let's look at the Columbian Exchange in terms of agriculture and labor. Now, even though the first European explorers were in search of gold and silver for the most part, they found that if they devoted these colonies, these new lands that they found, to agriculture, they could get fabulously rich. But there were far too few European colonists to attempt that kind of large-scale agriculture, so what to do? First solution, enslave the natives and make them do it. And this kind of worked, but there was a major problem. Turns out these natives knew their own land way better than the colonists did, and so they would often escape their enslaved conditions off into the hills and to the forests where they would never be found again. For example, the Portuguese dealt with this in their Brazilian colony. They started growing sugarcane there, and it made them so wealthy that when the natives ran off, they just went and cried in a bag of money. But it wasn't long before they got tired of crying into their money bags, and they came up with a different solution. And that solution was to import enslaved laborers from Africa, and in Portugal's case, especially from the Congo Kingdom. This solved the problem of the natives so rudely escaping because the Africans knew the land less than the colonists did. And as the demand for sugarcane and in other regions tobacco spiked, so did the demand for enslaved laborers from Africa. And that meant that millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and made to participate in what was called the Transatlantic slave trade. But in a strange turn of events, even though the African population was being largely deprived of its menfolk, the the African population in general rose significantly during this period. And the reason is, again, because of the Columbian Exchange. While enslaved people were being transferred from the east to the west, foods like yams and manioc were being transferred from places like Brazil into Africa. And those new foods created a massive population spike. And finally, we need to talk about the environmental impact of the Columbian Exchange. It shouldn't surprise you to hear that the natives of the American continents had been farming for many centuries, and they had developed ways to live with the land sustainably. But when the European colonists arrived and grew wealthy through agriculture, they started using the land much more aggressively. And that led to large-scale deforestation and the depletion of the soil. And because the Europeans tended to live in more densely populated settlements, they put a greater strain on the water supply and introduced a lot of pollution to boot. Alright, that's what you need to know about the Columbian Exchange. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. If you want me to keep making these videos, then subscribe and come along. And if you want to join the inner circle of Heimler's history enthusiasts, then you can consider supporting me on Patreon. Heimler out.